I've moved over to the sales worksheet in my workbook, and I wanted to get you familiar with what we have here. It's actually not monstrously large, but it does have about 51 records, but they're fairly simple or fairly straightforward sales records. We know that somebody got an invoice. There was a first name and a last name, or a last name and a first name for the customer. They placed an order on a certain date. They activated their purchase on a certain date. Then we have different types of customers, including private, corporate, and government. The types of licenses for software that they were buying had to do with Office 2010, Home and Business, Professional, and Professional Plus. We have a calculation that tells how many days it was between the time they ordered and when they actually activated, who their sales rep was, and of course the total order amount. Now all of this is very useful, except it does get, again, kind of cumbersome if it's anything more than about these 50 records. Chart and pivot tables have been two consistent and powerful tools in Excel for simplifying and summarizing data like this. Excel 2007 modified the specific processes we use to create pivot tables. And 2010 is adding yet another tool that's going to allow us to quickly and visually filter pivot table data. In order to show you this, what I've done is I've already created the pivot table. It's on the last worksheet called Sales Pivot. This takes all of the data from the sales sheet and basically breaks it down into a pivot table, showing a couple of things on the left side and just one along the top. Along the top is where we're seeing the type of customers: corporate, government, and private. There's also one record that has everything blank. Along the left-hand side, going down column A, we have actually two different categories. We have the type of software license, that Home and Business, Pro, and Pro Plus, and then we also have the names of each of our sales reps. So what we're able to see here very quickly is, for each type of license, which rep sold how much in sales to what type of customers. That's the thing about a pivot table. It's supposed to answer some type of a question, and that's the question that we're answering. In this case, instead of having to look at all 51 of those records, we can much more easily see exactly what we're looking for. Now, the second thing about pivot tables has always been that we can pivot or filter the information. We've already done the pivoting part. Let's talk about filters. Well, if I go up to cell A4, which is the drop down for my row labels, I can see that this is for license type, and I can see that I could filter between all of these different things. That's not new, but what I actually wanted to do was I wanted to filter for just Susan, who's one of my sales reps. So let me press Escape to get out of that, and in order to filter for Susan, I have to do a couple of things. The first thing I have to do is actually activate the correct field. In order to do that, I have to click somewhere on the field, then go back to the same drop down, and then I could come down and I could deselect all, and then I could scroll down, and then I could say I want Susan, and then I could say OK. Now, if that sounded a little tedious, it was supposed to, because it is tedious. Now, it's not that it's a bad feature, and it certainly is something we want to do, but that was an awful lot of clicks. And I don't want to do the clicks, and I can guarantee you that someone who doesn't really understand pivot tables is going to have a hard time figuring out exactly what they have to do. Even though in just a minute I'm going to show you a better way to do all of that, I did want to point out one of the new enhancements to 2010. Let's go back to this drop down for the filter. It's not really obvious to a lot of people unless I point it out, and what I want to point out is the fact that we not only have the ability to sort, which we had last time, and the ability to use checkboxes, but they actually have given us a search field. This is brand new, and it's built into all of the filters for tables, pivot tables, and pivot charts. So when you're working with especially larger data sets, you're not going to have to scroll up and down just to find little boxes that you want and immediately remove or add the checkboxes. I think you can again see how cumbersome that could become. When you type a value into the search field, you can type the exact value, part of the value, and you can even use your wildcards like the asterisk or the question mark. If I was going to look for something, and I'm just going to start typing an M, which is pretty short, we only have one entry, but you can see that you also have a lot of variations in what you can do with this. I can choose with one check mark to select all of the search results. So in this case, it would be everything that started with M, or if I were more specific, everything that matched the criteria. I can also add this search to the current selection. So I can build things kind of like a query builder where I want this and this and this. There's a lot of different things that you can do with this, and at first it seems like it's very simplistic, but as I said, especially when you're working with very large data sets, This search capability within the filters are going to be a phenomenal tool for making our work a lot easier, a lot faster, and prevent an awful lot of clicking on little checkboxes. I wanted to show you that before I got into another one of the new features. Let me press Escape to get out of my filter. And then let me go up to the Contextual tab for my Pivot Table Tools. In order to do that, I need to move up to the upper right-hand edge of the ribbon and simply go to the Pivot Table Options tab. Now, all of this isn't new. A lot of it we saw in 2007, but if you haven't used pivot tables since 2007, you will find that the entire way that we work with them is different, even though the concept is the same. Well, my cursor is currently in the pivot table. I've gone to the Options tab, and now I want to use this new feature that I've been telling you so much about, or at least hinting at for the last several minutes. It happens to be something called a slicer. And a slicer is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's going to allow us to slice the data. Let me show you. Let's click on Insert Slicer, and then click on Insert Slicer, and that's going to bring up the equivalent of a field list. I'm simply going to place a check mark next to each of the fields that I might want to quickly filter by. So I'm thinking for this particular one, it's definitely sales rep because I want to find Susan and Mark and those other people very quickly. And I also probably want to be able to filter by license type. Then I'll say OK, and here's where you get to see the magic. What are created are individual windows for each of the fields I selected. And I'm just going to move these over so that we can see them separately. One for license type, one for sales rep. And if you look very carefully, you'll see that license type has most of them shaded, but the one at the bottom is a lighter shade. On sales rep, on the other hand, only Susan is highlighted, George is almost grayed out, and the three at the top, Beth, John, and Mark, are there but not shaded. This is because slicers visually show us what is being filtered in the pivot table. So for license type, we're currently showing everything, except there's nothing to show for blank, and that's why that one's at the bottom and it's grayed out. For sales rep, we do have sales for Beth, John, Mark, and Susan. We do not have any for George, so again, George is at the bottom, but currently Susan is the one that's highlighted because she is the active filter. Do you see how easy it is, instead of having to go in and go through all kinds of things or really know your data in depth, to easily be able to tell exactly what is being shown currently in the table as compared to what's available in the table? This is already a great start, and we haven't really even used them yet. Well, I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Let's learn how to use them. But actually, this is the easy part, and I bet every one of you knows how to do it because you know how to click, how to do click, shift, click, and how to do click, control, click. By that, I just mean selection. So if I very quickly said, only show me things for Beth, I can simply click on Beth. And immediately it is filtered for Beth. If I wanted to choose two people that were not right next to each other, I could click on one, like Beth, hold my control key on my keyboard, and click on Mark. Now we have two that are selected. If I wanted to select a range of people, for example, John through Susan, then I do click, shift, click. Click on John, hold my shift key, click on Susan, let go of everything. So you see, these are really just standard universal selection techniques by clicking or clicking in combination with either the shift key or the control key. I can do this for any one of them. So only show me Professional Plus licenses that were sold by John. Now, it may be that your pivot table doesn't have any data, but it was very easy to find out what the data was. Let me go back here, Home and Business, and let's do Home and Business for Beth. I don't know about you, but I've worked with pivot tables for a long time, and to me, this is a lot more intuitive and easier than working with the in-cell filters. Now, what happens if we want to get rid of the filter? Well, we can either select all of the buttons in the list by doing a click, shift, click, or we can move to the upper right corner of the slicer and click the Clear Filter button, and I'll do that for both. In this case, they'd both be about the same, but remember, if we had hundreds of entries for a field value, then the button would be much faster than scrolling from the top to the bottom of the list just to make the selection. So far, so good. They're easy to enable, and they're easy to use. But of course, what would life be if we couldn't adjust stuff? So when you have a slicer selected, you can actually configure it. I'm going to configure the one for license type. Make sure I have that selected. Then you'll see that we have an Options Contextual tab. I can actually change the name of the slicer. That might be useful if maybe you're pulling this from a database and the actual field name doesn't make sense to people. You can put in a more grammatically correct logical name. You also can adjust slicer settings. It tells us what the name is. It tells us if we even want to see the header. We can put in a caption, and we can work with things like how the buttons on the slicer are sorted. Are they ascending, are they descending, or are they based on a custom list? You also have the option to choose if you want to visually indicate items with no data and whether they should be shown last. And we're already seeing that. If I kind of move this box over, that's exactly why we're seeing things like George at the bottom with different shading. They're shaded differently because of the first check mark. They're placed at the bottom of the list because they don't have any data. Now, why would you ever want to turn that off? Because sometimes people want to see things in chronological or alphabetical order, even if there's no data associated with it. So it's just an option. All right, let me go ahead and cancel out of that. Of course, it wouldn't be the new versions of Office if we didn't have the ability to stylize our slicers. I don't necessarily spend a lot of time doing this, but you certainly could. We can change the colors. Maybe color coding will help people to see that they are different, to not get confused on which one they're clicking on. There's a variety of reasons you could do this. You also can work with a variety of arrangements, which isn't usually an issue, but you can, over towards the right-hand side, also work with buttons. For example, if I don't want to see it long, I want to see it wide, I could actually have there be 2 or 3 buttons across to optimize. This, again, is going to depend a lot on how much data you have and how many buttons there are. We can also change the width and height. Now, speaking of all of that, we can do that with the actual slicer itself. But don't forget, this is really just a window, so all of my usual tools work. I can move to a corner, I can drag it to make it larger and smaller, all of the things that I'm used to doing, including changing the vertical size. If you want to simply get rid of a slicer, that likewise is very easy. Just click on it, and I'm going to press the delete key on my keyboard. Remember that we can also right-click on slicers to get a lot of these different options as well. Let me go ahead and make one last adjustment with my slicer. Let's just choose the Home and Business category, because I wanted to remind you that even though this is a new way to work with filtering, it doesn't replace the filter. If I move over to my Row Labels filter and click on the drop-down, I can see that currently we're working with their sales reps. So there again is that kind of irritating thing that we have to remember. Let me press Escape. Let me go back to the level that I want to see by clicking on Home and Business. And now if I go back to that drop down, I can see that even though I've done this with the slicer, it's exactly the same as coming in here and working with the checkboxes in the old way. So it still accommodates the way people are used to working with it, but it certainly makes it more intuitive, easier, and faster for people who like the new way or don't know the old way. Now, before some of you send me emails, yes, I do know that we also could adjust the field being filtered on right from the in-cell filter where it says Select Field. But my point here is that even with that feature, slicers are still easier and faster. Let me go ahead and cancel out of that filter. And just finish up by saying, I don't know about you, but I have a smile on my face because segmenting data has never been easier. Slicers don't give us necessarily new functionality. You know, a lot of things in 2010 are brand new. A lot of things are enhanced. Well, this is kind of somewhere between the two. It's not new functionality because we've had the ability to filter for a long time, but these bring the functionality to the forefront, making it more visible, more intuitive, and in some ways even more fun, certainly more efficient, to filter data than it ever was before. This way we can spend more time analyzing the data and making good choices based on the data rather than simply formatting the data in the pivot table itself.